and welcome to the next European Long-Term Investors Podcast. My name is Helmut von Glasenapp and I'm the Secretary General of the association. ELTI is a coalition of 31 national promotional banks and institutions, or NPBIs, all over Europe who invest in their countries and even beyond. Nearly 160 billion euros in 2019. One of our hopes with this podcast is to be able to help you better understand the mission and the added value by doing this business. You can look forward to interesting discussions with interesting partners about interesting topics, how to enable growth, sustainability, resilience, and about our work. We are on Twitter at ELTI Association and LinkedIn, so please you can follow us there as well. In a bit, we are introducing our listeners to the world of NPBIs and to what we do, our business models, and what our added value is for the economy and on society. Today, we are traveling to Hungary and we will learn a bit about the Conference on the Future of Europe. Our oldest member, the French Caisse de dépôt et consignation, was founded more than 200 years ago. Many European countries implemented a national promotional bank or institution after the Second World War. For example, Germany started in 1948 with KfW, or the Spanish Instituto Crédito Oficial, ICO, has its 50th anniversary this year. Many countries in Central and Eastern Europe started immediately after the change of the system in 1989. One of them is the Hungarian Development Bank. The Hungarian Development Bank, or MFB, has 30 years of experience how to promote Hungarian SMEs and how to make best use of public budget, structural funds, guarantee instruments, the inclusion of private investors and the best combination of all of them. I'm together with Csaba Harsányi from MFB, and we will dive in the big figures on investments and what are key issues in the implementation of promotional instruments. Csaba, I mentioned the fact that MFB, what is by the way the pronunciation in Hungarian language, started its activities in the early 1990s. What was and what is your role and how does the European Union help MFB in fulfilling its tasks?
Hello Helmut, hello everybody. Glad to be here with you. Right, MFB indeed is going to celebrate its 30th birthday this year. The predecessor of the bank was established in 1991, so right after the system change, and we got banking license in 1993. Throughout its history, MFB had slightly different roles in different periods of time. These roles were and still are a bit overlapping, but in each decade there was one particular task that was the main emphasis of the operation of the bank. In the 90s, this was the restructuring of the Hungarian economy from a centrally run, centrally managed economy to a market economy. And this included heavy involvement from the part of MFB in managing and restructuring and selling state-owned assets. In fact, in the first decade of its existence, MFB was MBFB. The second B stands for investment. So it was not just Hungarian Development Bank, it was Hungarian Investment and Development Bank. Investment meaning that we have invested heavily with our own resources into state-owned assets and try to reorganize them and then sell them for the market. This was the 90s. In the 2000s, the emphasis shifted to regional development and infrastructure. In the 2010s, the emphasis shifted again for supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. And now we are looking in the 2020s into the new challenges and objectives. MFB is and always was a banking group. We have had different subsidiaries throughout the time. So when MFB established some of its affiliates or subsidiaries, the aim was to introduce these kind of instruments to the market. I mean, the instruments that these subsidiaries were involved in. For example, when it comes to regional development, we had within the bank a group that was responsible for managing our units on the ground, but these units were later on taken away from the bank and were partly privatized and became instruments and institutions on their own. There are some subsidiaries which remained in the bank. This is what we call the core or strategic banking group. And these include, besides MFB, the headquarters, which is mainly involved in promotional lending. These subsidiaries include equity companies and guarantee companies as well, and also quite famous student lending companies.
Csaba, you described the change of the mission of MFB in the course of the last 30 years. I suppose your shareholders decided. Who are the shareholders of MFB, and what is their intention in giving MFB the different roles? And the second question, you didn't disclose the Hungarian pronunciation of MFB.
Yes, the Hungarian name of MFB is Magyar Fejlesztési Bank, Hungarian Development Bank. As I mentioned previously, it was Magyar Befektetési és Fejlesztési Bank, Hungarian Investment and Development. And the owner has always been and will always be the Hungarian state. Now, the representative of the state, depending on the era that we were working in, has changed from time to time. In fact, at the beginning, when I mentioned in the 90s, our role was predominantly working with state assets and privatize them. For a short period of time, the government was represented by the Hungarian State Privatization Agency. So they were sitting on our board. Most of the time, it was one or the other ministry. And now we are lucky to have a ministry that is only responsible for managing state assets, including the MFB group. So we have our own specialized minister to take care of us.
The ownership by the Hungarian state, does it mean that they can tell you you have to give money to this or that company, to this or that project, or how does it work? Because I'm not sure that civil servants or even politicians are good bankers. How does it work in MFB?
Well, it's not exactly the way you described. Of course, they would like to interfere and they would like to steer our operations, and they do that. But they do that by setting the objectives. We are invited on certain level government discussions about economic policy of Hungary, and we as a bank try to signal the areas where we believe banking instruments, financial instruments can be deployed. And there is another approach to the same question, is that we are trying to, with the financial instruments that we are using, we are trying to develop the market in a way that areas which in the past were only dependent on non-returnable assistance, on grants, could benefit from these financial instruments and could make use of these financial instruments and can make a business case. I mentioned in our previous, in my previous paragraph, the regional development role of MFB. This is a very good example of that. Regional development per se was not something that was known in communist Hungary. You didn't have regional development policy, you didn't have regional development agencies, and of course you didn't have regional development financial means either. Now, MFB was tasked by the government to develop regional development and the support of regional development by financial means. So we were tasked to try to find out the best possible financial instruments to support regional development in Hungary. And we did that with a long-term view of these instruments, these institutions becoming a business case of their own, which means that they would be sustainable by the market without state support after a while. So to cut the long story short and to try to answer your question in one sentence, we are in constant discussion with the government through our owner, and we are trying to fit our specific banking view into the objectives of the politicians and try to tell them and educate them, if you like, where and how financial instruments can support their vision, their objectives.
Your bank was founded in 1991, and Hungary became a member of the European Union in 2004. When did MFB use European financial instruments the first time, and what difference brought it to the bank and to the country?
Interesting question, and I'm always proud to say that we have already been using EU funds before Hungary even became EU member. Some of the listeners might know or might remember that there used to be a pre-accession instrument called FAR for the Central Eastern European countries in order to prepare them for the accession to the European Union. These funds were channeled through a similar system to today's structural funds into the corresponding economies. And in Hungary, again, based on government decision, a relatively large part of this money, 22 million ECUs at the time, we didn't even have euros, of course, 22 million ECUs were designated or labeled to support state-owned company restructuring and privatization. So exactly the objectives that I mentioned before that were also on the flag of MFB. So MFB actually became a financial intermediary, if you like, for these specific financial instruments that was financed from the pre-accession fund of the European Union and was channeled through MFB into state-owned companies in the form of preferential long-term loans. And these loans were used, again, to restructure these companies, to make them more appealing for the market, for the foreign investors, and to try to sell these assets at a higher price. So this was mid-90s, 95, COP95, Country Operational Program 95 included this envelope, specifically designed for financial instruments for privatization. Now, on a more systemic base, it was, of course, when we joined in 2004, there was only a fraction of the programming period, of the EU programming period, between 2004 and 2006, in which we could enter. Now, to be able to design and implement financial instruments, this period would have been too short. So the first programming period was the 2007-2013, when we established a specific company, also nicknamed it the Jeremy Company, which was designed, its sole purpose was to use EU structural funds in the form of financial instruments. These financial instruments included preferential loans, combined loans, grants, equity, and guarantee. The big difference between that programming period and the one after, the one we have just finished last year, is that this specific company that was established for this purpose merged into the bank, into the Hungarian Development Bank, and became a unit, if you like, within the bank. And we at MFB, or we as MFB, became fund of funds for structural funds financial instruments. Again, these instruments range from preferential loans to loans combined with grants, and also different equity instruments. The guarantee instruments are handled by a separate company called Garantica, one of our subsidiaries.
The COVID crisis had significant impact on the Hungarian and the European economy. Based on the forecast of the European Commission, the Hungarian economy has gone down by 6.4% in 2020, which, by the way, is better than the European average. But unemployment has gone up everywhere, and you've more public debt than the years before. What was the MFB's response to the crisis?
We have been mandated by the government, again, similarly to the previous periods, to try to develop and implement financial instruments to support the economy, especially the sectors that are worst hit and most vulnerable by the crisis. So last year, approximately a year ago, it was last March or last April when we came out with a comprehensive support package for companies. We called them rescue package, which included 3 different loan programs, 2 guarantee programs, and 4 equity programs, all designed and implemented by MFB Group. The loan programs included completely new instruments, but they also included instruments that were changed, the conditions of which were changed due to the crisis. This one, again, I can come back to the EU financed institution. This was one of the most successful instruments that we used from structural funds, a loan program for SMEs. And the extension due to the crisis included the inclusion of working capital in the objectives of the loan. So until the crisis hit, it was only possible to finance investment. And since March last year, you could also finance running costs, working capital with the exact same loan program. These loan programs, most of the time, include a very low interest rate, sometimes even 0%. They had relatively long maturity periods, 7 to 10 years. And of course, the guarantees or the collateral were also lightened in the light of the crisis. Now, when I speak about loan programs and in general about lending by MFB, I have to mention the specificity, which is, I think, true for quite a lot of development. Development banks have difficulties, and certainly MFB had difficulties, and this was one of the tasks that we had to overcome, to really reach the smallest SMEs in rural Hungary. Development banks are most of the time one single institution, usually in the capital of the country, with no or relatively small outreach, direct outreach to every village. We had faced the same challenge too, and there was a big debate in the bank, how shall we overcome this hurdle? Shall we establish our own subsidiary network, our branch network? Shall we try to buy one that already exists? Which one is better? Which one is cheaper? Which one is more economic? And in the distribution of EU, of structural funds money, we have found a solution that is quite unique in Europe. We have procured a network of commercial banks, but we are using them only, and only I put in brackets here, we are using them only as our sales agents. They have to promote our products, but they don't have necessarily to take any risk on behalf of us. We are taking the risks. They are distributing our products based on their own networks. They have to signal, they have to make their branches similar. This is what we call MFB points in commercial bank branches. And they have to promote our products and sell and distribute our products. This is the network that we rely on when it comes to SME financing, and within SME financing, surely when we are talking about relatively small tickets of program financing. When it comes to larger infrastructure financing, of course, the headquarters can deal with the project on its own and doesn't need necessarily such a network. Coming back to the rescue package, so as I said, we had 3 different loan programs from own resources and from EU resources. We had 2 guarantee programs, again, extension of and easing of existing guarantee programs. And we also had 4 equity programs, most of them disbursed through our financial intermediary, our owned financial intermediary called High Ventures. We have 2 subsidiaries that worth mentioning, which operate in the field of equity financing. High Ventures is the one that is taking the real venture capital role. They are supporting startups with pre-seed, seed money. And we have another company called MFB Invest, which deals with much larger tickets and goes up until the IPO of the projects.
Yeah, the cooperation with private banks, notably in the field of SME loan financing, seems to be best practice. We heard of this in a similar way in our last podcast with the Irish SPCI. They do exactly the same, and they don't even have branches all over the country. So I think you are quite on the level of best practice. When recording this podcast today, we are in the middle of the 3rd wave of the COVID pandemic, and we can't imagine that after the crisis, hopefully very soon, the recovery will start. But I suppose MFB has already started to make plans how to restart the Hungarian economy. What will be MFB's contribution to this restart in Hungary?
Yes, so following last year's rescue program, we are now having what we call a restart economic package driven by the Hungarian government. Now, this restart economic package has all kinds of different instruments, from revenue tax exemption until the age of 25, different moratoria, and it also includes a preferential loan program with which Hungarian Development Bank was again mandated to deal. This loan program addresses the most vulnerable small and medium-sized enterprises. It has a 10-year-old maturity with 3-year grace period. This is very important, I think. So for the first 3 years of the loan, the beneficiaries don't have to pay anything. And even then, after that, for the rest of the maturity, the loan is interest-free. The amount that is available for one single project ranges between 3,000 to 30,000 euros, so relatively small amounts, almost microloans. And it can be used for anything from working capital to paying the salaries of the people, to investments, to paying utility bills, anything. Also important, that is 100% pre-financing. So the whole loan is available in the first year after signing the contract. And then afterwards, the beneficiary have to present the invoices, not the other way around. This is the product that is being launched now, has been launched in the beginning of March. And there are also plans to include new loans in the portfolio of the restart package. But this is the flagship so far.
Do you have a long-term vision for the bank? What will MFB do in 2025 or later?
According to the strategy that has just been approved by the government recently, we are, as most of our counterparts in Western Europe, we are also turning green, blue, sustainable, and digital. Now, of course, with the crisis, we have to define our objectives a little bit more mundane, a little bit more down to earth. And what we have put in our strategy, the MFB would like in the next couple of years to contribute to the sectors in Hungary which have the biggest contribution to the national GDP, which has the biggest GDP multiplicator effect, and which have the biggest employment multiplicator effect. Now, maybe it's worth mentioning for the listeners what this multiplicator actually means. Multiplicator, both in GDP and in terms of employment, means that by investing 1 unit into the sector, into the company, how many units worth of GDP will be created, how many units worth of employment will be created by this 1 unit of investment into the sector. Now, strangely enough, we have made a calculation and we have a graph, I see it in front of me, showing the different sectors and the multiplicator effect on the GDP. And the highest GDP multiplicator effect is done by financing and insurance. Then different services, human services, social services, then building industry, teaching, and the list goes on and on and on. At the end, the very end of the list is waste management. That has the lowest contribution to GDP. So these are the sectors that we would like to focus on, and we would like to do that by also focusing our activities into a few sectors. So rather than having a lot of products, we would like to focus on 2 or 3 products when it comes to distribution through our network, and we would like to also focus on a handful of large projects that are key for the Hungarian economy in making the country greener, bluer, more resilient, more sustainable, and more digital.
Thank you very much for these insights in the reflections about the strategy of a national promotional bank and institution, in this case into MFB's reflection for the Hungarian economy. What else happened the last weeks? Earlier this month, the presidents of the European Parliament, the European Commission and the European Council signed a declaration to launch the Conference on the Future of Europe. This will be a discussion forum meant to give citizens a chance to shape how the European Union will look like in 5, 10 or 20 years from now. The formal start of the conference will be the 9th of May, Europe Day. 17 years after the Convention on the Future of Europe, which discussed about the integration of 12 new EU member states, including Hungary, European citizens are asked to express their views about Europe. how democracy could be strengthened at the European level, or which topics should be emphasized. The contribution of the European Union to fight against climate change and the COVID pandemic, or the institutional setup, will be very likely under discussion. All of you, all European citizens, should make use of this opportunity for discussion. Your view is important, and we are happy to have this possibility. We are nearly at the end. Thanks for listening and traveling with us to the tasks and the business of the Hungarian Development Bank. And if you massively disagree with something we've said, if you have a burning question, or just want to say hello, please drop us a message on Twitter or send us an email. We are on ELTI Association, and please hit subscribe to this podcast on whichever app you're using. You can find us from now on YouTube as well. We will be back again soon. Take care, and thanks once more to Csaba for giving us these useful insights. Thank you, bye bye.